Welcome not only those that are here in person, but those that are dialing in via WebEx. I'd like to thank the National Multifamily Housing Coalition for sponsoring today's discussion, and both the National Apartment Association and the National Multifamily Housing Commission for commissioning the very interesting study that Paige is going to present today, U.S. Apartment Demand, a Forward Look. And you can find a copy of the report on our website as well as on their website on our events page associated with today's discussion. So today's participants are Paige Mueller, who's the CEO of Whitegate Real Estate Advisors, LLC, and one of the authors of the study. Priya Jayachandran, who's the Senior Vice President of Volunteers of America. And Volunteers of America is one of the largest nonprofit developers and providers of affordable housing in the country. And Jamie Woodwell, who's the Vice President, Research and Economics at the MBA. So today's agenda is as follows. Paige is going to start out presenting her new study, U.S. Apartment Demand, a Forward Look. This is actually a really interesting study. She hasn't shied away from issues like how to calculate the loss of the existing housing stock, the impact of immigration, and how to take into account the possibility of different economic scenarios and federal policy changes. So, our view at Urban has always been that data elevates policy debates. Once we get the facts right, we can assess the impact of different policy choices and only then determine the best path forward. So, thank you very much for this thoughtful study. Priya is going to discuss the affordable and subsidized sectors of the market, having spent many years at HUD before joining before joining Volunteers of America. And then Jamie is going to go last and provide some observations on the market sector. Just an FYI, Jamie just came out with at the end of June, just came out with his Q1 data book that has become a very important source of information for this market for all of us, so you may want to check it out. When we finish with our three speakers, we're going to have a Q&A from for the last 20 minutes or so of this State of Talk, which is going to run to 2 o'clock. Webinar guests can submit questions to events@urban.org, that is events@urban.org. Please identify your name and company. And again, we're going to post materials from the talk on our events page, www.urban.org events. Just a reminder, our next event is a sunset seminar on duty to serve at 5:30 next Wednesday, July 19th. This event is co-sponsored with our strategic partner, CoreLogic. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. Paige, please start us off.
All right, thank you, Lori. We're really happy to be here. As Lori said, this is a project that we did for the National Apartment Association, National Multifamily Housing Council. We were first tasked with looking at forecast demand for the multifamily housing rental stock through 2030 for the U.S., all 50 states, and then 50 representative multifamily apartment markets throughout the country. The team, there were 4 of us, 2 PhDs, Norm Miller, who is a professor at University of San Diego, Jeff Fisher, professor emeritus at Indiana University, Michael Den, who specializes really at the very micro level of housing demand and feasibility, and then myself, who was fortunate to start in the research world and spent a good time there, and have moved over to the dark side, more on the investment side and consulting, but still a long background in research. So we spent about 6 months on this. Just an immense amount of information came out of it. We started at that demand, but really to get to demand, we had to look at a number of factors. There's literally a 170-page book. You can pull it up at weareapartments.org if you want to see the full details behind it. And as Lori said, there's pieces of this, so we could spend the entire afternoon just talking about parts of it. So I'm going to skim the very high level of some of the results and the interesting things that came out of it. We focused on the multifamily investment stock, which is units that are 5 or more units in a building. Looked at population and households, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. Components have changed, a lot of interesting things happening on immigration trends right now. And then look at a number of things that affect the home ownership decision, and that's another a big area of discussion that we can go into. We also factored into the study homelessness rates. They're small in most areas, larger in some, usually about something less than 0.2% of the population. Also about 2.5% of the population not living in household quarters. So looked at factors such as that. Natural vacancy rates vary across metropolitan areas, so those with higher construction tend to have more obsolescent issues and higher natural vacancy rates, so looking at things like that. Lori mentioned obsolescence. There's been a number of studies just on that factor. We chose to look at a rate that's closer to about a 70-year lifespan for multifamily product, but certainly all sorts of variations in research around that factor alone. And then the size of the stacks, so that was kind of surprising to me. We started with census data. We had 2 different private data providers. What we found on those was that the private data providers tended to have more robust estimates of stock than the census on markets that were heavily institutionalized in the ownership. Less so, the census had better data on markets that were not as institutionalized. So spent quite a bit of time just trying to figure out what the current size of the multifamily stock was right now. And then we had to do a forecast. We assumed 2 recessions happen by 2030, a more mild one just because we're at a mature part of our economic cycle in the near term, and then a more severe one by 2029-30 that has to do more with policy issues and maturation of some of the pension and healthcare issues. So overall, we focused on the little green sliver there, I believe. My eyes are not so good. Yes, the little green sliver there in the top left, that's the rental housing of 5+ units. So really, this study is only looking at about 16% of the housing stock. You'll see more than half the stock is single-family owned. And then we also have a good part that's also smaller, under 5 rental units, that does not tend to be on the institutional radar. But I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So I want to talk about some really big key trends that are really driving the results all the way through from the national down to the metro. The first thing is our aging population. And this becomes really important for some of the metropolitan areas. So you'll see here, if you look at the top bars, which are the older population, that's 65+, you see it's becoming a more important in growth factor as the population becomes older. And those younger parts of the population are shrinking as our population ages. And this has big implications for particularly some metropolitan areas. So we tend to think of apartments as that 25 to 34 age group. It turns out they're really a very small part of our current rental population. 65% of that rental population is older than 35 years old. So we really need to be addressing the issues of our renters who are not all young single people in the market. We're seeing this trend actually, a couple things happening even at the young side of the population. So our younger population are delaying family formation and marriage. So first of all, they're just getting older later. The second issue is they're having children later. So it's great to be in that great urban location close to your job, all your friends, the bars are next door, et cetera. But once people start to have families, as homeownership rates start to go up and our rentership rates go down, when they're delaying marriage and they're delaying childbirth, this tends to drive up higher renter rates for longer periods of time. This takes that slide a couple slides ago and really makes it more visible. So you see that dark block at the top, that's the 65+ group. As recently as really currently the 2010 to 2020 period in that middle bar, We see demand coming by really across all age groups. We go to 2020 to 2030, and it's really dominated by that 65-plus age group. So a large part of our demand coming up the next decade is going to be from those baby boomers that are now hitting retirement age, and just huge implications, particularly for parts of the Northeast in the country. The second key trend that we see going across here, and this one really creates a lot of uncertainty in our forecast, and that's the dependence on immigration. Those dark blue bars are population growth that has either happened already on the left side of that graph or is forecast to happen from net new immigration from outside the country. The yellow bars are just our natural increase births minus deaths. So you see historically more of that growth has come from natural increases. The forecast going forward, you'll see again the effect of the aging population as those yellow bars start to come off a little bit going forward. That's the effect of the aging population. We had a big debate then on what do we do with the forecast of immigration. So we started this in November of 2016. So think about what our news was saying in November of 2016. So we looked at a number of other sources that would forecast immigration. And the blue bar, you see it kind of dips down in our forecast. Every single one of our data sources was just taking that blue bar and raising it up pretty much in a straight line going forward. And we felt really uncomfortable, particularly at that point in time, of saying we're going to have more immigration in the next 5 years than what we've had in the past 5 years. So we pulled it down a bit, certainly up for debate. But what happens with this, and this is the really important part of it, is even with our more conservative projection than any of the other big data sources that we can find that are projecting this, 49% of our population growth over the forecast period, which is through 2030, is coming from international immigration. So we are much more dependent on that immigration than we have been even in the last 10 years. So if we pull immigration out completely, so again, we have this aging population growth, we have slowing population growth. We're currently at slightly under 1% population growth. That was been a little bit over 1 historically. If we take immigration out completely, by the end of this forecast period, we slow to about 0.2 to 0.3% population growth. And that is really critical because that underlines everything we're doing in our economic studies and our housing forecasts, et cetera. So we have this big uncertainty right now on policy issues surrounding immigration. So we looked at this factor at a state level and at a metro level as well. So this map shows the states that are more dependent on international immigration as part of their forecast population growth. This one was really interesting to me. I went into it thinking it was going to be the border states, right? So the dark green is the states that are more dependent on immigration for population growth. So these are the states where we think we have the most error in our forecast because they're more dependent on policy and we're not really sure what that policy is going to be. I came into it thinking it's going to be the border states. We have California through Texas bordering Mexico, certainly lots of ties there. We have Florida that has huge ties to South America. And what happened is those border states, they tend to have younger population. We'll leave California out of this discussion for a minute, which is my home state. But the other border states tend to have lower costs than some of our coastal markets. They're getting good migration in there. So they're getting positive growth in the births minus deaths. They're also getting good domestic immigrations coming into those states. And so they are getting international immigration, but it's getting offset in its importance by the good growth that's either happening within the state or between states. California having a little bit, you can see California is a little darker green than some of those states. California definitely having some issues with affordability and pricing right now, both in business costs and cost of living for residents. So this drives our slow growth states. They're losing population, they're older, they're not getting as much internal growth, and so they start becoming much more dependent on international immigration into those states. So that was kind of surprising, and those are the states where we're more unsure, we have more margin of error in those forecasts because of that issue. The second important part of the international immigration is that international immigrants tend to be renters, much more so than domestic. So the blue bars are rentership rates from people who have moved from abroad. The red bars are domestic. So you can see where we have more international immigration, we tend to have more renters. Now, they do tend to own more as they've been in the country longer, but we definitely see a big difference in rentership rates from those people. The other area where we see really big differences in homeownership rates or rentership rates is when we look at it across race and origin issues. So the non-Hispanic white alone segment of the population by far has the highest home ownership rates, and less so when we look at the non-white households. That's important because we also broke down population growth by those same factors, by origin and race. And the little blue segment on the very bottom, that's the white alone. So it's the biggest part of the population, the least amount of growth coming forward. So most of our growth is coming from those non-white households, which means that's also driving our expected rentership rates up. The other factor that we see, we talked about the young side of the population. They're forming families later, which gives us smaller households. A number of other factors going on that we don't have to go through. Divorce rates up. We have the aging population, so at some point those older households also tend to have smaller households. So a number of issues driving the size of households to smaller sizes. So that drives our household growth up higher, percent growth up higher than our population growth. And then household size again by race, and we could just go into so many details. The white non-Hispanic tends to have lower household sizes, so we see another part of the data that is showing that we could have higher household sizes, even though for the higher household sizes, Hispanic was the highest. Those are also coming down. So we finally get to our big decision, and we have to decide in this forecast what the 10-year decision is going to be. How do people decide if they're going to own or going to rent? So we went through some of the big key factors already that we looked at. Our other dilemma in doing this is that home ownership rate has pretty much nothing to do with all the things that we would have thought it had to do with. It doesn't track economic growth in any way whatsoever. It doesn't track job growth. It doesn't track unemployment rates. It doesn't track capital market trends, affordability issues, and we ran through all of these. What it does start to track very closely, there are a few demographic things that come in there, but we ended up with a model of 3 demographic and economic type of factors and 5 policy issues. And we could spend all afternoon going through debates on these issues. We stripped out demographics and economics and capital market factors, just put in policy issues. And excuse me, there are policy issues that really have to do with the banking industry. So policies back as far into the late 70s that required banks, for example, to address more of the low-income, moderate-income neighborhoods. So that was the old redlining type of issue back in the 70s, up through the regulations that allowed banks to merge and create our too big to fail banks. Those sort of factors load in. Other policy regulating Fannie Mae and Freddie on how they can, how much again of the affordable housing issue that they're addressing. Those policy issues just tracked very closely what we were seeing in changes in home ownership rates. So we saw 2 things really affecting this. One is we had a hangover from the 2008, right? We have really low home ownership rates right now. They're starting to improve. Some hangover issues having to do particularly, going back to the economy, there are first-time home buyers really struggling to come out of the 2008 recession. They had much higher unemployment rates than young people. They had much higher student loans. Some of them in the middle part had more issues with their current housing. We had a lot of the short sales, et cetera, happening in that first-time home buyer segment of the population. So we have some hangover effects that are slowly going away and improving. But then we have these long-term factors of home ownership that we just discussed. And so what we see then is, and one more thing, and so the older homeowners the older population tends to be more likely to own their house. So that's on the other side, as we have an aging population, then we drive to higher home ownership rates. But all the other factors that we just talked about, we're still expecting that home ownership rate to come off a little bit from where it is now and then stay relatively low and not go back to where it was at the peak back in 2005 and 06. No? Okay. So we end up with multifamily units. We end up needing about 4.6 million new multifamily units by 2030. Remember, this is just that 16% part of the housing equation, a part of the housing market. It ends up being about 1.3% growth per year on average. You'll see that little dip at the end in 2030 where, again, we were a little more conservative and just assume we have some sort of recession happening in that time frame. I can't tell you if it's 2029 or 2030, but we're assuming sometime in this time frame we probably have something that slows it down a little bit. There are certain markets that are quite very big, quite large. Over 1 million of those are in the top 5 markets. It's New York, Dallas, Houston, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Atlanta, and LA comes up in there as well. Certainly New York and LA, for example, are really big markets. So we looked at this a number of ways. This shows number of new units by size of the market. So the red and yellow dots are where we need the most new units in terms of absolute numbers. The blue and the purple are the slowest, the smallest. And some of this is just size issues. We certainly have some very big geographic markets on the coast. But we'll see a trend that we often see when we do these sort of studies, which we call the smile. It kind of goes from the west coast down the south and up to the east coast. And we see a similar trend here. When we look at this more on a percentage growth, we see a little bit of difference. You'll notice California, that's very green here, so that's kind of average growth. When we looked at it before, we saw higher numbers, so there's a bigger markets. But in terms of percentage growth, they're not coming out the top. And again, I think that goes back to some of the cost issues that we're seeing in California that are affecting both businesses and individuals in that state. We also see consistently that Midwest to Northeast is showing up on the slower part of our growth forecast. So we took a look at those markets. And this is where just so many interesting things came out of this study. And it's so important to look below just these top numbers. So just as kind of a teaser, we started looking at types of markets that are very similar in their attributes. So one was to look at those slow growth markets. Many of them are dominated by that 65 plus age group. So that's where, going back to where we were talking about earlier, these are markets where most, if not all, of their growth is going to come from that 65 plus age segment. So we have markets, for example, so their age demographics tend to look something like this. Those green bars are the 65 plus new rental demand for 65 plus households. And then you'll see on the negative, the yellow, the blue, the red, those are an out-migration of younger populations. So it kind of hides what's really going on and what the real needs are in this market. So we could say for Detroit, I think we need like 25,000 or so more new rental households in this time period. It doesn't seem like much. But if we just look at that 65 plus age group, we need more than 60,000 new 65 plus age rental housing units for this market. So a lot of things going on under the numbers that get hidden by the top line. So these markets, again, they tend to have out-migration of young workers. They tend to have older populations. I mean, there's so many, we could spend a lot of time just talking about what happens in those type of markets when your workforce gets out of balance with your retired population. It starts to have all kinds of implications for your economy. They often have higher home ownership rates, again, because they're older populations. And many of these also tend to have lower income. renters, which is another really important attribute to be thinking about when we start thinking about affordability and price point and what this particular metro market needs. These also tend to have higher older housing stock, so the age of the rental property also tends to be older. That does give us some opportunities to provide affordable housing without having to do new construction. A second group we looked at, we called the Gen Z markets. So these are markets where a large part of their growth, over 30% of their growth, will come from the age group that is less than 34 years old. And this is how we traditionally would think of apartment demand. We would see demand here across all the age segments. Certainly the blue and the orange bars are is that younger segment, so they're a large part of that growth. And this is how we traditionally think about apartment demand. But in fact, only about 20% of our markets have this type of growth dynamic happening underneath. So these markets, they tend to be high growth markets. They're attracting new people both internationally and from other states. A lot of them have low costs, both of doing business and of living there. They have incentives for companies to start businesses in these areas, lots of land available for new development, and they tend to have more affordable housing markets and more construction happening in these type of markets. Another area that we looked at were supply restrictions. A lot of interest in this. So we looked at supply restrictions on two different fronts. One is to look at just how much land is available. So if you're on a coastal market, you often have restrictions, geographic restrictions. There's water there. Some of these have hills and mountains there that make it difficult to build. And the second area that we looked at were regulatory restraints. There's a limited amount of data on that. We did find a study, though, that had really looked in detail at regulatory estates across metropolitan areas throughout the country. We had to replicate that for a few of the metro areas that weren't covered under it. But it looks at factors such as how long does it take to get something through the approval process, how many approvals do you have to go through it, do you have to go through approvals even if there's the zoning works, et cetera. And so you'll see here the red dots are the areas that are more restrictive in either geographic or regulatory restraints on new development. And the blue and the purple are the least restrictive. So what are the implications of these issues? This is showing the amount of supply, restrictions versus the affordability of rental properties. So how much of the rental population is spending more than 35% of their gross income on their rent? And you'd see really quite a bit of variation, so this is certainly not the only story in this market, but we do see a tendency for these markets to be less affordable for renters. The other thing that we see coming out of that, again, lots of variation. This graph, those same markets, the supply restriction index versus the amount of inventory growth. So they tend to have less inventory growth. And that's important because when we have shortages of housing and we have high costs, and we have to serve those population bases in some way. So again, we could spend all afternoon just on this topic, but there's certainly a debate as to how those regulatory restrictions are helping or hurting those local markets, and and then how do you serve the population base and give them affordable housing. So here are the markets that have a higher share of income going towards rent. So those dark green markets are where renters are spending more of their income on rent. Not surprising, it's California and New York right up there, those high cost markets. I was a little surprised to see Florida there, and I think that's more of an issue. We have a lot of retirees there driving those incomes down on paper compared to what housing costs are. And so then we looked at, well, what's causing the affordability issues? And a lot of different issues are happening. So those coast markets, again, tend to be high cost. The red markets are just markets where you have a lack of available space. So they tend to be coastal. That's Hawaii, Florida there. Some of these have multiple issues, but there's, these are the more predominant ones. And then you have the middle, kind of in Louisiana, Alabama, they're just lower income markets. So lots of different reasons why we have affordability issues, and it really varies by geographic area. So we looked at it more of a case study at San Francisco, for example. So San Francisco has a really interesting income dynamic going on. So you see the bars on the left. To the left of that graph are lower income, the percent of population and lower income levels. And so we tend to see, as shown in that gray bar, more people in the lower income levels. And as your household income goes up, you have fewer of your households in the higher incomes. San Francisco makes a U-shape. We have lots of low income, and then we have lots of really high income households in this market. And it kind of saves it in some of the rankings when we look at things like percent of income spent on rent. San Francisco doesn't always rank at the very top of those, even though it's a high cost housing, because it has some of the underlying income dynamics going on. But again, this hides some of the issues that are really happening in some of these high cost markets. So even though we have these high household incomes, you can't see this one very well, but we just pulled up, let's just see how many households can afford some of the current things that are up for rent this is in the city of San Francisco. So we had calculated back here 31% of the population earns less than $35,000 a year, so they can afford housing of about $1,000 monthly rent. And we have another third of the population. These are the middle income people, right? Their household income is up to $75,000. So it's $75,000, and we assume they can spend somewhere around $2,000 a month on rent to keep their rent to income ratios in balance. So you said, okay, someone making $75,000, that sounds pretty good. Let's see what they can afford when we look at what's available on the market. There was nothing. So the SoMa South of Market, that's one of the prime submarkets in San Francisco. A lot of new construction happening in that market. Tech companies are just moving in there in hordes, starting lots of new offices. So this is a big submarket. Lots of jobs, lots of high incomes in this market. There was not a single space up for rent in that market for under $2,000 a month. So if you're making $75,000, you're not living by yourself in the city of San Francisco. You're going to have to live with other roommates. You're going to have to live somewhere outside the city because you cannot afford to live in the city in this area. So we went back and said, okay, if we'll do it the other way. Let's see what the average rent is. The average rent is somewhere over $3,000 a month. So what would you need to earn to afford just an average apartment in the city of San Francisco? Well, you need over $100,000 in income to afford just an average apartment there. That's less than 30% of the households. This is in one of the cities that has the highest incomes in the country. So what do we do with the other 70% of the people that can't afford an average apartment in the city? There gets to be lots of media hype and lots of neighborhood, not my backyard stuff. I don't want any low-income affordable housing, but these are, at 70,000, these are teachers, firefighters, police officers, et cetera, that can't afford to live in the areas where they work. So we looked at this a little bit more broadly. Even if they go to the East Bay, which is definitely more affordable, there's still incomes levels that are about 60 to 70% of where their income needs to be to afford an average apartment, even in some of the more far out suburbs. So we have commute patterns, people driving farther and farther away to get to housing in these. And these are good jobs. People are critical to keep this economy functioning. What happens when housing costs really get out of control? So Los Angeles, for example, in San Francisco, because of those high incomes, like I said, our home ownership rates for whatever reason, don't tend to be at the far extreme. In Los Angeles, they do. And in New York, they do. We have bigger populations. They're encompassing more people with lower incomes, or bigger geographic areas, sorry, encompassing more people with lower incomes. These are two metropolitan areas that rank really low on housing affordability, both for renters and for owners. And so we looked at migration patterns. So the yellow bars are the populations being formed by people who live there already. So this is births minus death. The purple bar is population growth that's happening because of either U.S. migration into that metropolitan area or by international immigration. So people coming from without the area into that metropolitan area. The top is what's happened historically. You'll see both LA and New York had big out-migrations of people. That's moderated a little bit. They've both been able to create some jobs and keep people there. And then the bottom is a forecast. And again, we're seeing that they're going to have to evolve with their own internal population. And having lived in LA for the last 4 years, there was just news story after news story. We would joke that Texas was stealing all our jobs because just one story after another of companies moving to Texas. So we have, again, we talked about low income. This is low income, so you'll see that tends to be kind of more in the Midwest and the South. The other thing, so some of the conversations that are happening, well, how do we meet this need? Because the developers are focusing more on the high end of stock, right? They have to promise their investors some amount of return. Their land costs are really high. Their construction costs are high. And we have the other part of the market focusing on low income. What happens to the middle? There's a large part of our apartment stock that's older, that just needs to be rehabbed. You can rehab this stuff without going through some of the entitlements and construction processes that you have to go through for new construction. So we have 11.7 million units built before 1980 on the rental stock. That's quite a bit. Again, that tends to be concentrated in the Northeast. California also pops in there as a market that has quite a bit of older housing stock. We also have the small unit buildings. So the single family market has been institutionalized recently. The 1 to 4 unit part of the rental stock is similar in size, just a little bit smaller than the single family rental market, not institutionalized at this point in time. And so it'll be interesting to see if people start to pick up. And in fact, I am working with an investor now that focuses just on that part of the market and has huge efficiencies and can offer all types of amenities to their tenants because of that. And so they're providing high quality residential units in this 1 to 4 unit building segment. We also looked at what we called second tier affordable rentals. I think some ULI reports call these naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAA units. A similar concept. These are lower cost, low amenities, non-institutional. It's a big part of the market that could be addressed. And that, similar to where the old stock is, the red and yellow, a lot of that's in California, some of that in the Northeast as well. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much. That was fabulous. Once you give Priya the clicker, and
yep.
Great. Move straight to Priya. Thanks. We're going to hold questions till the end. Questions and discussion till the end.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Priya Jayachandran. I am a new developer. I joined my current organization, Volunteers of America, 2 months ago. Volunteers of America is a faith-based nonprofit, a human services organization, and as Lori mentioned, one of the larger nonprofit owners of affordable housing. VOA owns a portfolio of roughly 20,000 units, roughly 500 properties of largely subsidized affordable housing around the country. This is my first foray into development, so although I will try and talk from the perspective of a developer, it's not necessarily firsthand. That said, I've been around affordable housing developers for nearly 25 years. Before joining VOA, I was at HUD for a few years as part of the prior administration, and then was at a couple large banks financing affordable housing. And so I feel like I have a fairly good perspective on it. I made sure to disclose to Lori multiple times that I am not a researcher and I don't have a lot of data at my disposal, but she insisted that there was a value in a practitioner's perspective and the anecdotal. That said, I come to urban and I always think data, and so I reconciled it in my mind by saying that maybe I could help highlight some of the places that more data is needed, or that some of the data and research could start looking at in the future. So Lori asked me to talk a little bit about both the subsidized stock and the workforce housing stock, as Paige said, sometimes called NOAAs, and asked to explain why a subsidy needed. And I had the pleasure of participating in a panel a couple weeks ago with Tom Bizzuto, for those of you who are local, who owns Bizzuto Development. And I think that Tom says it better than anyone. It costs the same, the wood, the granite, the concrete costs the same, no matter whether you're building an affordable housing apartment or a market rate apartment. The costs don't change. And the reality in many high cost markets, including the one that we live in here, is that there's simply no way by making the affordable rents, the rents affordable, to get to even cover those costs, let alone allow a developer to get a return. And I know that Erica's team here a couple years ago did a nice little game and graphic to try and illustrate that point. But that's the fundamental challenge of affordable housing and why subsidy is needed. The number one driver, let me go back to the context. Lori had shared with me this chart, which does a nice job of summarizing the loss in affordable housing units. I think most of us have heard, and we see in our daily lives, that the need for affordable housing is exacerbating. I think Paige pointed out a number of the graphs. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition just published their annual Out of Reach report. It's a really good report if you get a chance. And the probably top bullet point from that is that for a worker earning minimum wage, they would need to work 117 hours a week to afford the median rent in the United States. Rents are increasingly unaffordable, and I've heard Erica again talk about that subsidized housing is only available to 1 in 4 of those renters who need it. So at the same time that we need more of it, we have less of it and continue to lose it. On the affordable housing stock, we really have two big programs, and they're kind of more demand side and supply side. On the demand side is the rental assistance programs, and these are oftenly branded as the Section 8 program, project-based Section 8, the 202 program for elderly housing, and 811 program for disabled. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that but for a tiny portion for the 811 program, none of those programs exist anymore. Project-based Section 8 was repealed in 1983. Not a lot of people realize that. When we talk about the $11 billion appropriation for Congress, what that is renewing those existing contracts. And those existing contracts decline because of either physical obsolescence or people opting out of the program. Thankfully, for the last few years as an industry and as a society, we've had a good success at reversing the trend of people opting out, but there's always that pressure and temptation. But we are not producing any new rental assistance. The 202 program was funded up until 2012. That program, so you would see new construction of subsidized elderly housing. That program has not been funded in 5 years, so no more new construction of elderly, low-income housing with rental assistance for renters. And the 811 program for disabled, it does exist. It's a very small program. On paradigm shift a few years back. It was really block granted to the states. It's been a little bit challenging for states to get that money out. And as an aside, that's been complicated by a Supreme Court decision a few years back, the Olmstead decision, which mandated that people with disabilities cannot be concentrated in group home environments. So you need to scatter them throughout. I think from a policy perspective, it makes intuitive sense. It's a little bit more challenging on a real estate level to think about integrating and apartment units that are serviced for disabled persons throughout apartment buildings, but it's a very small program. The shining light in the situation is on the supply side, the low-income housing tax credit. That program, designed and implemented in 1986, today it is the single largest driver of affordable housing production. It's tied to populations administered through states, but the reality is that program has not kept pace with population growth, and we are not producing the amount of affordable housing that we need, hence the 1 in 4 number. VOA and most of my career has been spent working closely with the low-income housing tax credit. I think it's a program that has improved over time, but is a highly competitive landscape out there right now to win low-income housing tax credits. And the reality is that in many markets, the tax credit is simply not enough subsidy. That alone does not change the calculus that Tom Bizzuto talked about, so additional subsidy is needed. There's been a lot in the news about home and CDBG, because those are programs that are frequently coupled with the low-income housing tax credit to make the economics work, and those were programs that have been questioned recently in the news and by the administration. As an aside, did note that the THUD subcommittee of the appropriations did pass a bill that will go to the full appropriations committee that did restore much of that funding. But it's a very competitive landscape for low-income housing tax credits, not uncommon for owners like my organization to apply several years and have to try and pigeonhole the affordable housing, what you're building, into a state's priorities, be they green housing, veterans housing, things that the state is clearly trying to motivate and increase. The low-income housing tax credit, obviously the T and the C credit, tax credit, mean that it's tied to tax rates and in particular corporate tax rates. So with the election and the prospect of tax reform, low-income housing tax credit pricing has taken a huge dip, probably a dip of approximately 15%. The good news is that most of the people syndicating credits and buying credits have seemed to settle in their minds on a projection of a 25% corporate tax rate. So obviously, less than the 32, 35, but after the election, there were folks that were modeling 15%. Obviously devastating effects on the value of the credit and what it meant for low-income housing tax credit projects. My organization, in one project that hadn't closed prior to November, lost $2 million in the equity side, and then interest rates had gone up, so it cost about $3 million in extra financing costs. And there were a lot of programs and a lot of projects that were simply stuck. I think it's fair to say that the market is stabilizing. Of course, if tax reform produces something other than the 25% and lower, obviously going to have a different impact. But right now, I think it's a tough environment. You have folks that are doing building projects, and obviously 9% credits, which is the more valuable of the two credits in the low-income housing tax credit program, are definitely oversubscribed, but it's been a challenging environment for new production. There are also, I think, a lot of policy challenges that surround the low-income housing tax credit. And the one, maybe from my years at HUD, that's top of mind is really the linkage to outcomes. And I think the Raj Chetty study in 2015 really brought this home for a lot of people. It was based on HUD's Moving to Opportunity demonstration in the 1990s. It was a longitudinal study following folks who were receiving vouchers and looked at them over a 20-year cycle and looked at their outcomes. And the conclusions were not so different than what you might predict, but a little unsettling nonetheless, is that location matters, and that a zip code is very predictive of your later outcomes, be it education, earning potential, family stability, and other things. And so it's really shown a light on where we place properties, and this tension that is constantly simmering in the affordable housing world between the need for production and the need for what we call, or often called, neighborhoods of opportunity. And neighborhoods of opportunity, not surprisingly, tend to be more expensive. Therefore, if you've got a fixed amount of subsidy, harder to put as many units there. And so this tension between quantity and call it quality, it's a little oversimplification. And also local politics, a case that went to the Supreme Court in Texas about preferences of where you put housing and concentration of poverty, minority concentration. The reality is that many cities will and jurisdictions will encourage affordable housing development, not surprisingly, across the other side of the railroad track, so to speak. And so, but the counter argument is that, and I think a lot of nonprofit developers, and I know POA and TCB, the community builders who really are leaders in community revitalization, would say that often a neighborhood is revitalized through that affordable housing catalyzing other development. But for that catalytic effect of affordable housing development, some of those neighborhoods might not be transformed. So it's not simply that you put it in the high income area, but a lot of policy debates. I think most of them are healthy, but clearly no resolution, and in trying to navigate them, probably adds a little bit to the costs and the challenges of building affordable housing in the first place. It's a complicated, complex system that on average takes 3 years to build an affordable housing development. And many of these are garden style, simple, with siding construction, built in under 12 months. So it's not the construction, it's really that lead up period. Other scarcity is clearly the scarcity of the low-income housing tax credit. It's a very scarce resource. It's one of the only subsidies out there right now for affordable housing production. And then perception. I think that there is still, to a certain degree, a stigma in this country to affordable housing, and a lot of NIMBYism. And so you find a lot of jurisdictions that simply will fight a low-income housing tax credit, and a lot of mayors and counties who will try and push the affordable housing to those other areas to avoid local politics. Pivot a little bit to the workforce housing sector. Given both the scarcity of the low-income housing tax credit and the reality that the low-income housing tax credit is limited to 60% area median income, and the data that Paige shows is that there are a lot of people earning 100% of area median income or 120% that still can't afford market rents. And so there's been, I'd say, a trend over the last 10 years to really focusing on workforce housing. And different folks define it differently. I'd say the range is between 60 and 120% of area median income. Some people define it from 80%. Some people define it 60 to 100, go up. I've seen it as high as 150% in higher cost areas. And what you're typically talking about, and CoStar did some research and a lot of data on this last year, is predominantly these are C-class properties and naturally affordable, but naturally affordable partly because they're C-class properties and they're not in great condition. And what a lot of the data showed is that many of them have code violations too. And this has been a hyper-competitive asset class for growth for both institutional owners, smaller owners, and even nonprofit owners. VOA and all of its peer organizations have started to look at workforce housing for a number of reasons. One, if you're a nonprofit developer, is the mission. You see that need to serve those other folks. Two is the scarcity of the low-income housing tax credit. It's becoming harder and harder to make a business out of only doing low-income housing tax credit work. And third is the low-income housing tax credit is largely a fee-based business. Because of the restrictions on the rents, the properties don't appreciate. It's not a cash flow play. It's mainly a fee play. And to diversify, particularly in the current challenging environment where people don't know where things are going, most businesses are trying to diversify their revenue streams. And on the workforce housing, the thought is that's more of a cash flow stream, a cash flow play. The reality is, and I've seen this both in my old job and my new, this is for each, call it C-class property that goes on the market, there are probably 15 to 20 bids on this. They're going very high, and folks are eating this stuff up right now. We have been outbid. We've put in bids on these type of properties in southern Florida, in Durham, North Carolina, in Phoenix, in Houston, and outbid. And what brokers are telling us is that folks are not even going out. We go out and send somebody to see the property. People are not seeing them. They're really, to the point that Page demonstrated, they see the population growth in certain markets, they see the appetite for multifamily rental, they see income stagnation, and this type of asset class is really being eaten up. There have been innovations. There's an affordable housing, workforce housing REIT that's been established, lots of vehicles to try and make mission-based owners more competitive in this landscape. But I think this is a really challenging asset class. I mean, on one level, to the point that Paige indicated, I mean, people are buying up the stock. I'd say from a policy perspective, the challenge is many of these are not mission-based owners. A lot of these properties are C-class properties because they're just crummy and not a lot of data to support that these owners are going to come in and change those conditions. The reality is that they need work and there's no return on that investment. So I think that's an interesting time in that class. I don't want to end on such a negative note. I think that there are opportunities in the future, and I think that one of them that Paige highlighted and I forgot to put up here is, first of all, the local barriers. What Jason Furman, when he was at the NEC, did a paper a couple of years ago that showed that what we often think of as the cost of land being attributable to scarcity, that call it Washington, D.C., and good neighbors not having a lot of land, is actually more attributable to our zoning and our regulations, that we artificially depress our scarcity or our availability of developable land. And if we were to free up some of those air rights and some of the changing the zoning restrictions, then we could see land costs come down and the opportunity for more affordable housing production. And I think there's an opportunity to change the conversation and to brand affordable housing as not low-income housing, but really about those teachers and firemen and how we service their needs, and also subsidies become a bad word in this country. And I think really trying to change that conversation and explain that subsidy is a reflection of our national priorities. And then this is where an area that I do think that the housing field, whether it's affordable or market rate, could do a better job. I've had the opportunity the last 15 years to be actively involved in the charter school community here in DC, and I'd say that the education industry has been more innovative than the housing industry has. And I think that there's an opportunity to try new demonstrations and figure out new models for that aging population, for mixing incomes, we have I've lived in DC for 15 years, and you don't see a lot of change in what's built. And I think, we've seen demographic changes, and our housing stock hasn't kept up with the trends. And I think that there's a real opportunity to push the envelope and demonstrate new models. And I'm, run out of time, but happy to talk about what some of those new models could be.
Thank you.
Thanks. I guess I'm up next. Thanks so much to Lori for inviting me, for being here. Sort of my task was to look at the markets, and given some of what we're seeing in terms of the demand that's going to be coming, sort of how do we feel about the market's response? What do we think about how the market is going to respond? And particularly, I think, moving a little bit from the affordable to the market rate, sort of what are the experiences and how can we think about that? When pulling together the slides and then thinking through, so what are some of the learnings from the information I was pulling together, sort of here are the 5 takeaways I had. First, just sort of setting the scene. When you look at the Great Recession, it just gave the rental housing market this double whammy of challenges on both the demand and the supply side that we've been trying to work through since. Point number 2, the market has responded, and I'll talk through some of what we've seen in terms of the response. It's taken some time. It's clearly not universal, but we have seen a market response to the tight market conditions we've seen. 3 is that we're in a really interesting time right now in terms of the environment in which all this is happening, and I'll touch just a little bit on the low yield environment and what that means, and some really interesting aspects of that. 4, something I think that is important for all of us to take a look at is that housing costs in general in the U.S. rise faster than other costs and than incomes. Partly that's an urban economics story, partly other things. It may not be a great story, but it makes sense. And so rather than thinking of that as something to beat, I think we've got to sort of think of that as natural conditions that are going to be a challenge for us. And then lastly, that market reaction, of course, only hits a part of the market. There's a gap between many households' incomes and what it costs to build and maintain housing, and the market by itself can't address that. So what I'll do now is just sort of run through some of the charts and graphs that bring us to these conclusions, and we can sort of talk through that a little bit. So first of all, the Great Recession and the double whammy of challenges, both on the demand and the supply side. When you think about what happened during the Great Recession, we had a pretty dramatic supply shock. So new construction activity went down, close to zero, if not zero, on the multifamily side. At the same time, we were having this really significant demand shock, where you had both more families moving from owning to renting, as well as more families and households moving from higher income to lower income. Both of those increasing demand at the same time we were seeing that supply really constrict. This is a chart that I don't know if folks have heard of desert island discs, like the disc you would take to a desert island that you could listen to over and over again. This is my desert island chart. So this is one that it just sort of every time I look at it, I see something a little bit different. It is happily stolen from data from the great Joint Center for Housing Studies, State of the Nation's Housing. But what it looks at is the cost burden of households at different incomes, so starting at lower income households at the top, down to higher income households on the bottom, over time, so each bar represents a different year, First few years, there's a few gaps between, but then the last 4 or so years are consistent. And then on the left-hand side, you can see how many renter households there are in that income group. And on the right-hand side, you can see how many owner households there are in that group. And so partly this, just back to the desert island nature, really helps me sort of think about the housing market and what's comprised. But in particular, if you look down at the left-hand side, the renters in the lower income groups, and what happened between, I think that's 2000 and 2008 and 2012, you can see the really big jump there. As the recession kicked in, we had a whole lot of households losing their incomes, moving lower on the income strain, and also then moving into rental housing. So that on that demand side really having a very profound impact on overall demand. Again, that's at the same time that you had new supply essentially grinding to a halt. So then point number 2, the market has responded. When you look at what's happened with new construction activity, we now see it slowing rent growth and we see it slowing property value increases. The red line here shows the vacancy rate for multifamily units over time. This is a census gauge as opposed to some of the third-party providers that are more of the professionally managed. So this is a pretty broad group of apartments. The blue line shows the units under construction. And you can see the vacancy rate now is about as low as it's been any time since the mid-'80s. So an incredibly tight multifamily market right now. The blue line, the number of multifamily units under construction, is as high as it's been since any time in the mid-'70s. So an awful lot of units under construction right now. There's some differences over time in terms of how long it takes to build a unit, that sort of a thing. But I think this says there's a pretty clear market response to these tight market conditions and what we've seen. When you look at multifamily market fundamentals, if anyone can read the subtitles here, you get a prize. But upper left-hand corner here is the vacancy rate. This is professionally managed properties. Upper right-hand corner is the year-over-year change in rent. Bottom left-hand corner is the year-over-year change in net operating incomes, the incomes that properties are taking in. And then the bottom right-hand side is property prices. And so I take 2 things away from this. One, again, the impacts of the Great Recession, which really tightened the market up. You saw vacancy rates drop, you saw rents increase dramatically, you saw property incomes increase, and you saw property prices going right along with that going up. And then 2, what we've started to see more recently as that new development has started to come online, you can sort of see at the upper left-hand corner in the vacancy rates, a bit of a ticking up in the vacancy rates, starting to see that the new properties create some extra supply. You can see on the upper right-hand side, the rent growth has slowed. Still strong rent growth, but not nearly what it was a year or 2 years ago. Likewise, bottom left for incomes. And then if you squint really hard on the bottom right-hand side on property prices, you can see the beginning of this year, we've slowed that property price increases as well. So that new supply that we've seen, that market response, has started to have an impact on the market rate multifamily rental market. One other interesting point is, as I mentioned before, the low yields. We're in this incredibly low yield environment where treasury rates are low, stock prices are high, but PE ratios are high as well. You've got the overall investment world is an extremely low place, and that matters for multifamily too. I don't know how many folks here track cap rates, but this says, some see a building, my boy, I see a cap rate. And I think of if baseball has its batting average and hockey has its plus-minus rating, sort of real estate has its cap rate as the go-to stat, as a really interesting thing. And the capitalization rate is basically very straightforward, the net operating income divided by the property value. And it gives you an idea of essentially the yield that an investor is going to get on their investment in an office property, an industrial property, an apartment building. The red line here shows the cap rate over time. The blue line, as a bit of comparison, shows where the 10-year treasury is, often used as a measure against the cap rates and whether you're getting more or less spread over that 10-year treasury. And I look at this and I take a few things away from it. One is that if you think about just the return that, that investors are getting, it's extremely low on an absolute basis. There still is a buffer above the 10-year, but it's a very low yield, low cap rate that investors have. One thing that's interesting about that is that makes building a whole lot easier. So you don't have the same, if you've got a certain cost to construct, the low cap rate means that you'll go in that with less income than you would otherwise. So that's actually really helping that development process right now and the market's response. A really other interesting aspect about the low cap rate is, since it's measuring property value relative to income, largely driven by rents, you can look at this and say that for $100,000 of property value, we've actually never had lower rents. It's a really curious thing to think about, and I think says a whole lot about how high property values are right now, particularly if you look in primary markets, that sort of a thing. But this interest rate environment we're in and this cap rate environment we're in is a very peculiar time. And again, I think so far it's been a great tailwind for new development and for the market being able to respond to the demand. I won't go into depth on this, but you also have big differences from one market to another in cap rates. And so an investor is going to accept a lower yield, a lower return in terms of rents versus that property value in a New York or a San Francisco than they are in some other markets. That's having very profound impacts too on where investment dollars are being driven. One other point to drive at just for a moment is if you look at rents and what's going on with housing costs. The red line here shows on a year-over-year basis what's changed in CPI-U shelter. So essentially the way BLS measures what it costs to rent an apartment, to own a home, to get the shelter component of that. You can see some ups and downs. The blue line shows that standardized over a 10-year period. Real estate's a relatively long-term investment, so looking at what's happened over a 10-year period I think might be more interesting, again, from that investor perspective. So I'm going to use that blue line going forward. If you look at that blue line now on the shelter cost, the red line shows other costs, consumer costs, excluding shelter, all from the BLS series. And you can see consistently shelter costs have risen more than other costs. Given urban economics, other things, it makes a lot of sense. I think if you look at Page's numbers and the fact that we've got more of the growth is going to be in New York and LA, you think about the costs of New York and LA and the fact that we've been urbanizing, we've been moving to more major metropolitan areas, it sort of drives this. It's a greater challenge then for affordability and for the market to respond to more people. But I think given that this is going back to 1962, a pretty consistent trend there. And then overlaying household incomes in green here on the same chart and the 10-year change in household incomes, you see a relatively similar picture where there are times where they're running neck and neck and then times where shelter costs are running ahead of growth in household income. So all of that means that the challenges are even greater. I think sort of the final point is that the market has reacted, and it's reacted incredibly strongly to the tight multifamily market conditions. That the low vacancy rates and the strong rent growth have brought out an awful lot of development. I think those last few slides show that that challenge is going to continue to be there, though, that we've got households whose incomes don't cover the cost of building and maintaining housing, and given what we've seen over time with the differences in growth of shelter costs versus other costs and versus other housing, it's going to continue. I do think, touching on what Priya was talking about, there are a lot of great programs out there and a lot of experience working to fill those gaps that are up there. The challenge is really finding a lot of the resources that are that are needed to expand those programs to make sure that they're covering the folks who aren't being covered now and the ones that will be coming along soon.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you all very, very much for 3 great presentations. What I'd like to do now is open us up for questions. Online viewers can submit questions to events@urban.org. For those of you in the room, just hold up your hand and we'll bring around the mic. And please identify your name and company. So questions in the room? Yes, right up front.
Okay. Usually not the first one.
Yeah, you were really fast today.
Maybe that's because the last time I raised my hand too late and I was
Get squeezed
excluded.
out.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
I
anyway.
remember,
my
I
name
remember
is Joe,
squeezing you out.
So Joe Kirchner at Realtor.com, senior economist there. And we're, obviously we're focused on the counterpart, which is the homeowners, portion of the market. And so the contrast has been fascinating for me. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about in terms of the home construction is that both home construction and but the supply and demand in the market. Supply is going towards the moderate and low income because as prices go up and people's incomes are going up slower, they can't afford the 4-bedroom, they have to go for the 3-bedroom. So they're going down on the price range. Meanwhile, builders are only building at the higher end of the market. And so my first part, well, I actually have 2 questions, sorry, is are you seeing that same thing in the rental construction, that builders are building for the high end where renters are struggling to, even afford the moderate. And then the second thing that was fascinating is that you're saying that the market really has responded to the rental market construction. That's not the truth for the single-family homes. We're about 60% of where it should be. You said, yes, you have seen steady increase in construction since the recession, but we're nowhere near where we should be by historical standards. And why is that? That's kind of puzzling to me. Does anybody have any insight as to why the market is responding faster in the rental side than for the single-family home side?
I'll take a first crack. I think it's really interesting looking at the construction that's been taking place, and certainly the headlines are about high-end urban apartments in response to some of the demographics that Adrian was talking about and other things. I think there's a lot of demand. The fact that the vacancy rates are still incredibly tight there says that builders are building to what tenants are demanding. There's also the fact that if you're building high density, it's going to be more expensive. The land's more expensive. The construction's more expensive. But then you also see the market responding to that you also see a whole lot of headlines about the micro units and that developers are looking to ways to try and sort of bridge that gap and create a product that residents want. If you want to be downtown and you want to have lots of amenities and you also don't want to pay much, then how can you build that box? Probably a smaller box, some other things. But I think we've been seeing the market respond in a lot of those ways. Does that sort of sound right to you too?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying, that you, as a developer, you still have the same land costs, the same labor costs, the same materials cost, and so they have to promise a return to their investors, and they can't just say, well, we decided we like affordable housing better, so we're just going to give you less of a return. So they are building to the high end of the market, I think, for that reason. And then you have some financing mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms that adjust the low income part of the market, and then you have this whole middle part of the market where I think people struggle to figure out how to do it. And you're right, we definitely see groups now focused on these niche products, whether it's micro units or tiny homes or whatever to address that need, but it's a different product to address that need.
To your second question, Jamie and Paige could illuminate more. Just an observation that I have seen both in my own experience of owning a rental unit, but also seeing it in stock, is that people, not necessarily low-income people, but people in the middle to higher incomes seem to be willing to stretch more in how much they're willing to spend of their income on rent. I think, maybe you could argue that they would be willing to on the home ownership side, but the mortgage credit market won't allow them to. There are pretty well established percentages of, but since most people aren't seeking financing for their rent, it's really their own personal tolerance. And see people willing to spend, particularly it's a little bit for higher amenities and location, well over 50% of their income. And so this point about why it's keeping the multifamily market, you do see that higher end of the market. It's not that necessarily people, if you were to keep that 35% constant, I don't think as many people could afford it, but that seems to be elastic for people who are above a certain income level, and I don't think that the home ownership has that same ability to stretch.
Question in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. The name is Calvin Gurley, federal employee, but I did work on the mayor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Public Housing. There was a couple of things I wanted to bring up, but the first question I have is politics. Other three points are the value of the dollar, in which the United States debt is causing the value of the dollar to go down. So a $1960 doesn't spend the same as today. Plus salaries haven't kept up with inflation. But I want to know about the politics, and the politics, and I'm speaking locally here in D.C., is that D.C. is a government town. I mean, it's based on military pay. The 2 or 3 biggest employers, the federal government and the district government, besides Metro. And housing are going up to about even $1 million on Capitol Hill, which is a different animal than you may have in different parts of the Southeast. And how these employees can afford those particular homes is just crazy. So it was discussed in a last year at the Urban Institute here about a conspiracy, but I don't think it was a conspiracy, but it was a situation in which there was a think tank that pushed the Republicans to try to push some type of law legislation to cut out the homeowners' tax credit for the interest on their mortgage. And that would, as a result, kill the American dream of having a home, but it would inflate or increase the treasury at the United States Treasury. So that was attempted, was even thought about that. Now that's conspiracy theory, but that wasn't discussed either. But in D.C., it's sad that the politics prevents our most valuable profession, which is a teacher, not being able to live in the same area where she teaches or he teaches, just to be in commune with the children that goes to the same school, or firefighters or policemen or emergency workers are not able to afford to live here. So what are the politics? And this is just local.
Okay.
What are the politics associated with this?
So let me actually say one thing about the mortgage interest deduction, and then and that is, I kind of view that as having very little to actually do with the home ownership decision. Most lower income people do not itemize and therefore do not take advantage of the mortgage interest deduction. So you don't actually get a lot of bang for the buck for it. It's a very, very expensive deduction. However, I don't view it as having much of an effect on the home ownership rate. But with that, let me actually turn it over to Paige to talk about Paige, Jamie, Priya, whoever wants to take the local zone.
I think the thing one's hearing about more and more is the conversation moving from the national level to the local level, and in 2 ways. One is around a lot of the fact that to the degree there are some of the zoning or other restrictions that Paige was talking about, those are controlled locally and managed locally, and so that's the place to try and work through it. And then 2 is that there's, I think, been more focus lately on the fact that if you want to address housing affordability, whether rental or home ownership, more supply is a good thing, and that both that attitude coming to more localities, as well as just sort of looking at it at the local level to see if you can sort of incite more development activity, then what are the impacts that'll have on the ability to afford to rent or buy a house. Both of those seem like very long term, sort of moving the ship from where it might be going now to where it might be in the future. But I would say, having done my first affordable housing report 25 years ago on naturally occurring affordable, you do hear more about the local today than you did 5-10 years ago. Does that make sense?
Now, you bring up a great issue, and that's definitely a huge issue, particularly in some of these coastal markets that have really high housing costs. It's not the issue for every market, and so it comes back to different locations having different needs and very different needs, which I think is hard to address at the national level and maybe gets overlooked to some extent at the national level. On the regulatory side, it is so local. Even within a metropolitan area, it can really vary from one locality to another. And we've had some discussions about this issue because it is such a critical issue. We have a barbell effect on the housing market, right? And then this middle gets lost. And so the issue is how do you address that? And if you leave it to the local markets, especially in these high-cost markets that are land constrained, they're already very urban in some cases, there is definitely a not in my backyard. We don't want more housing of any, we just don't want more development of any type. And so our structure is to leave those decisions to the local regulatory bodies, which vary considerably across the country. Other countries don't do it that way. Other countries have taken that land decision away from the localities and moved it up higher. And so that's kind of an interesting perspective of looking at how other countries have dealt with it. But it is a huge issue.
I would only add that I think particularly in the affordable housing realm, it is very political, partly because of the need for subsidy, partly because of the NIMBY effects. Paige talked about San Francisco. San Francisco is a really interesting place from a housing perspective, arguably one of the most liberal cities in the country, and liberal on everything except housing. It's really interesting. There was a fascinating article, I'm trying to remember what the blog was, a couple of years ago, and San Francisco trends liberal on all sorts of policies, obviously, and voting records, except when it comes to housing, their zoning and their willingness to embrace affordable housing is very constrained. And I think people are very liberal until it affects their own quality of life. And I think a lot of the arguments are, well, we like the row houses the way they are, we like that, and a lot of it comes down to density, because in order to solve the problem, it's building a few taller buildings, and people don't want to change that. And so it's interesting, in California, people assume that, oh, well, California does it better. California is one of the only places that doesn't have by right development. Everything has to go through a PUD process. And Governor Brown introduced legislation last year that for urban infill development that had an affordable housing component, that it could be by right. And it got shot down. I mean, they knew it going in, but it was really to start the conversation. And it was a lot of the environmental groups fought it. A lot of the smart growth people fought it. So, within a certain agenda, there are lots of sub-agendas, and it's very political to get all of the support you need to try and change the situation.
I think we're unfortunately right at the hour, so I'm going to actually cut off the questioning, and our speakers will be around for an extra couple minutes. You can come up and ask them questions individually. I'd like to give our presenters a huge round of applause for 3 great presentations. Thank you all very much for coming today. Thanks to the webcast audience for tuning in. I'd like to thank NMHC for sponsoring today's discussion, and both NAA and NMHC for commissioning Paige's study, which was just extraordinarily interesting. Our next event, again, is our Sunset Seminar on July 19th on Duty to Serve. So with that, our speakers will be around for a few minutes. Please come up and ask them any remaining questions you might have.